Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Metal Meltdown. Today we are talking about a brand new collaborative album from American grindcore crew Full of Hell and American shoegaze crew Nothing, entitled When No Birds Sang. If you've paid any attention to grindcore and extreme metal over the course of the past decade, you probably already know who Full of Hell are. Records like Trumpeting Ecstasy, Weeping Choir, Garden of Burning Apparitions, critically acclaimed, super popular within the confines of like grindcore and extreme metal at least, cram-packed with chaotic, uncomfortable, disturbing, dark, uncompromising grind and noise and extreme metal. They are no stranger to collaborative efforts either, having previously made collaborative records and split EPs and singles with everyone from Nails to Code Orange to The Body, Merzbow. Hell, earlier this year they dropped a collab album with Primitive Man, and earlier this summer they dropped a split with Gasp. And though we haven't talked much about Nothing here on the Metal Meltdown, I have been paying attention to them and the stuff that they've done, their discography, their output, and I would say that based on what I've heard and based on what I've enjoyed, they're probably one of the more inventive and interesting kind of shoegaze or post-rock bands out there. With this in mind, I was absolutely hyped the fuck up when I heard that these two would be joining forces for this new album, When No Birds Sang. It very quickly became one of my most highly anticipated albums for the end of the year, which isn't really saying much, I guess, considering nobody really releases music around this time, but that's not really the fucking point, is it? The point is, I was fucking pumped. I was thinking to myself, you know what, these two bands, polar opposites in a lot of ways, but they're both very talented, and there's a lot of great potential for these two sounds and these two worlds to kind of like collide and emulsify into something really powerful. And for the most part, I would say that that potential has been reached and realized on When No Birds Sang. At its very best, it is an incredibly cathartic and brutal record. The problem is, though, at its very worst, it also ends up being a very straightforward, dare I say, boilerplate kind of shoegaze post-rock record, with a lot of aimless, spacious, droning sections that don't go anywhere, that don't really flow into anything, that don't really evolve into anything. And yes, before somebody says it, I understand that in the realms of like shoegaze and post-rock, you're not really gonna have these hard-hitting, super heavy, in-your-face riffs and demented progressions. You know, I get that, I understand that, but there's a difference between writing something that's meant to be more contemplative and that's meant to be more atmospheric and that's meant to be like more melancholic and moody, and something that just is kind of empty and doesn't go anywhere. And I feel like that's where a majority of the more shoegaze post-rock oriented material on this album leans towards and goes. We'll talk more about that in a minute, though. First, let's really talk about the good stuff on this record, because again, there really is some good stuff. I don't want to make it seem like I'm tearing this thing a brand new asshole, because I'm really not trying to do that. The opening number, Rose Tinted World, I think is one of the best album openers I've heard from anything Full of Hell or Nothing related, and frankly from any album in 2023. What an absolutely fantastic way to start this thing off. It just absolutely whacks you over the goddamn head right off the bat with these thick, towering, noisy, doomy, sludgy riffs, caked in static and feedback, complemented further by these screeching, aggravating vocals. Soon there are more ominous textures and soundscapes brought in, some more kind of like weird, droning, eerie guitars. And then right after the halfway point, Full of Hell and Nothing throw the mother of all motherfucking curveballs at you. And they eat that shit like an MLB superstar too. Things really quiet down. We begin to settle and simmer on some more anxious, minimalistic chords and progressions. And also, we begin to start layering like news reports and samples and recordings of news reports about the general state of the world and the environment. And Full of Hell and Nothing just kind of keeps building these layers, introducing more samples and more recordings, making the guitars gradually louder and introducing some genuinely like irritating electronics as well. I mean, by the time you get to the end of this, it sounds like you walked into the fucking TV section at Best Buy, and for some reason all the TVs are all tuned to completely different random fucking news stations, and in the background, somebody's just beating the ever-living shit out of a vacuum cleaner. It's just absolute madness, but I found it really interesting because I think it's a way of kind of like demonstrating the insanity and like the confusion of like the 24-hour news media kind of propaganda machine, and like how we're constantly being fed all this horrible news and how the world is just getting worse and worse and worse. And we're kind of trying to look at it through rose-tinted glasses. We're trying to see, the signs of a potentially better world, but the news just gets worse and worse and worse, and it gets crazier and crazier and crazier. It's just total doomer vibes. Like, in this moment, I feel like Full of Hell and Nothing are channeling, like, the kind of, like, politically charged bitterness and cynicism that we saw from Chat Pile on God's Country last year. Forever Well is a great cut as well. I like how it combines like full-on shoegaze and ambience and more atmospheric elements with like crusty, sludgy, doomy extreme metal. Hearing synths and keyboards and like shoegazy post-rock progressions and soundscapes like transition into like extremely menacing like sludge and doom metal with all these crusty layers of like static and noise. It's genuinely really cool. And then throwing in like these ethereal vocals on top of that, even better. The closing number, Spend the Grace, plays around with a very similar kind of formula, recipe, and blueprint, but it still works really well. I actually kind of like how this closes out the album on a very intentionally kind of anticlimactic note, just kind of like droning off into nothingness. Like, it does a lot to cement the tone and mood of this thing and really hammer home a lot of the vibes that you're kind of getting across this. Unfortunately, things start to get disappointing, for me at least, when I begin to pay more attention to everything in between all of these really great and really dynamic and innovative cuts. Because everything in between is, frankly, just very straightforward, very generic, and very unremarkable, like post-rock and shoegaze. They just kill the flow and the cohesion of this album, in my opinion. These tracks aren't, like, fundamentally awful or anything like that. Maybe if you listen to them individually, like as a post-rock shoegaze fan, you can just enjoy them for what they are and go, I really like the kind of vibe that this is creating. I like the environment that this is creating. And I wouldn't even disagree that maybe having at least one song like this would do a lot to give an album like this some fresh air, some breathing room. But did we need 3 tracks like this? 3 tracks that all just kind of do the same thing, and they're very empty and wide open, and they don't go anywhere? In my opinion, no, I don't feel we needed that. The cut Wild Blue especially, I feel is a tad egregious. Like, this is a 45-second interlude that got a little too cocky and a little too confident, and it just would not get off the fucking stage, and now we have to endure it for like 4.5 minutes. Really, the way I see it, we've got 2 albums that have been kind of sandwiched into one. We've got one album that's filled with some really imaginative and poignant shoegaze metal fusion stuff, and then we've got another album that ultimately plays out like a more safe, basic, unintuitive, but harmless kind of post-rock shoegaze record. Not fundamentally awful again, but definitely forgettable. Lucky for Full of Hell and Nothing, though, I think the good most certainly outweighs the bad, and I think it's worth noting that production-wise, this thing is stellar. Performance-wise, this thing is still stellar. I'll give this an enthusiastic 3 out of 5, but also simultaneously an unenthusiastic 3 out of 5, if that somehow makes sense. Like, enthusiastic because the best parts are really so fucking cool and I want people to check it out, but also not enthusiastic because, damn, there are some, like, boring, lethargic sequences here that, again, I was skipping over on every repeat listen. I'm curious to see how the respective fan bases respond to this album. I'm not really sure if there's a lot of crossover between Full of Hell and Nothing and their demographics and all that, but like, who knows? I mean, they're both signed to Relapse, and they're both very weird and forward-thinking, and they both kind of approach heavy music in their own way, so maybe there's some real crossover there. I don't know. We'll see. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be. So what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe right here so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. And as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.